The coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. When the waitress said the name Dalton Brennan, the color drained from Clifford Vance's face like he'd seen a ghost. Because in the world of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, Dalton Brennan was a ghost. A man who wasn't supposed to be alive. Not after 15 years of silence. Not after the blood debt that was never paid. Before we ride into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Because some tales disappear when good people stay quiet. And too many men have already vanished that way. Now let me take you back to where this all started. The coffee cup stopped halfway to Clifford Vance's lips. Steam curled upward, forgotten, as the words hung in the air of Rosie's diner like smoke that wouldn't clear. The young waitress had only been making conversation, filling the silence between refills, with the kind of small talk that passes through truck stops and roadside cafes 1,000 times a day. But when she said the name Dalton Brennan, something in the room changed. Hatchet, that's what everyone called Clifford these days, set the cup down with a hand that trembled just enough for the other men at the table to notice. His knuckles went white against the chipped laminate, and behind him, Augustus Whitlock exchanged a look with Waylon Harper that spoke volumes neither man wanted to voice. Because in the world of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, Dalton Brennan wasn't just a name you dropped over lunch on a Tuesday afternoon 15 miles outside Bakersfield. Dalton Brennan was a ghost, a man who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Not after everything that happened 15 years ago. Not after the way he disappeared so completely that most of the brotherhood had convinced themselves he'd probably moved to another state, started over, maybe even died quietly somewhere nobody would think to look. The diner sat on a stretch of highway that time had mostly forgotten. Inside, the air carried the permanent smell of burnt grease and old coffee, the kind of place where the menu hadn't changed since 1987, and nobody seemed to mind. Truckers stopped here when everything else was closed. Locals came when they wanted to eat alone without running into anyone they knew. It was September 2025, and the afternoon sun cut through the windows in dusty shafts that illuminated the wear on everything they touched. The vinyl booths were cracked and patched with duct tape. The floor tiles had lost their pattern decades ago. Even the flies seemed tired, circling lazily above the counter, where pies sat under plastic domes like museum pieces nobody intended to eat. Bridget Brennan had worked at Rosie's long enough to know the rhythm of the place. Morning shift meant truckers and construction crews. Lunch brought whoever happened to be passing through. Afternoons were usually dead, which is why the four bikers had caught her attention when they rolled into the parking lot on machines that looked like they cost more than she made in 6 months. She'd seen their kind before. Leather vests with patches that told stories she couldn't read, boots that had walked through more miles than most people drove, faces that had seen weather and violence, and the kind of freedom that came with choosing a life most folks wouldn't understand. They weren't the type to cause trouble in a place like this. They were just passing through, same as everyone else. She'd been topping off their coffee when one of them, the big one with the salt and pepper beard, mentioned something about the Harleys parked outside. Nice machines, she'd said. Her father had one just like that fat boy from 2009. Same color, same model. Been sitting in their garage for years, just gathering dust under a tarp. That's when Clifford Vance's world tilted sideways. "What's his name?" the biker had asked, and his voice came out rough, cracking like old leather left too long in the sun. Bridget had hesitated, reading something in the man's face she couldn't quite identify. "Dalton Brennan," she'd said. "My dad's name is Dalton Brennan." The coffee spilled. Not much, just enough to puddle on the table and make Clifford jerk his hand back like he'd touched something hot. Gus Whitlock, sitting to his left, went completely still. Across the booth, Waylon Harper set down his fork with exaggerated care, and Fletcher Boone Fletch, to anyone who'd known him longer than 5 minutes, stared at Clifford like he was watching a man have a heart attack in slow motion. Ghost Gus whispered, barely audible. "Ghost is alive." Bridget watched the color drain from Clifford's face. She'd seen enough regulars have medical episodes in this place to recognize when someone wasn't okay, but this didn't look like a stroke or a heart attack. This looked like a man seeing something that shouldn't exist. A man confronting a piece of his past he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten where he left it. "You sure about that name?" Clifford said, and it wasn't really a question. His eyes searched Bridget's face like he might find a lie hiding there, some mistake that would let him go back to his lunch and forget this conversation ever happened. "I'm sure," Bridget said. "Dalton Brennan, he's my father." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to break furniture. Outside, the highway hummed with the occasional passing semi. Inside, the refrigerator behind the counter rattled and wheezed the way it had been doing since before Bridget was born. Someone in the kitchen dropped something metal that clattered against tile. Normal sounds, the world continuing like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Clifford Vance had been riding with the Iron Wolves for 32 years. He'd seen brothers die on highways and in hospital beds. He'd watched marriages fall apart and businesses fail. He'd buried men who'd been closer to him than his own blood relatives. And he'd done it with the kind of stoic acceptance that comes from understanding that death and loss are just part of the deal when you choose this life. But Dalton Brennan wasn't dead. Dalton Brennan had just been forgotten. The guilt hit Clifford like a freight truck doing 70 on black ice. It hit him in the chest hard enough that for a second he genuinely couldn't breathe, and behind that physical sensation came the memories he'd been avoiding for 15 years. "Does he still ride?" Clifford asked, and his voice sounded like something broken, trying to hold itself together. Bridget shook her head, and something sad flickered across her face. "Not in a long time. The bike's been sitting in our garage for maybe 15 years. Just sits there under a tarp gathering dust and spiderwebs. I don't think he's touched it since Mom died." 15 years. Clifford did the math in his head, watching the numbers line up with a precision that made him feel sick. 15 years since Dalton had stopped answering phone calls. 15 years since he'd stopped showing up to runs and rallies. 15 years since the brotherhood had collectively decided it was easier to let a broken man fade into nothing than to figure out how to help him carry his grief. They told themselves he needed space. That's what they'd called it. Space. Like abandonment was a gift when you packaged it in the right words. Bridget was still standing there, coffee pot in hand, waiting for some kind of response that made sense of the tension radiating from the table. She wasn't stupid. She could read a room. Whatever she'd said had opened something these men hadn't expected to deal with on a random Tuesday afternoon. "Your father," Clifford said, slowly testing the words. "Dalton Brennan. He's still in Bakersfield." "Been there my whole life," Bridget said. "Same house we've always lived in." Clifford nodded, processing information that felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable. Of course Dalton was still in Bakersfield. Where else would he be? Men like Dalton didn't run. They just stopped being visible. They just faded into the background of their own lives until everyone else forgot to look for them. Gus cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We knew a Dalton Brennan," he said carefully. "Long time ago. Good man. One of the best we ever rode with." Bridget's expression shifted, something like recognition dawning. "You're Iron Wolves," she said, not quite a question. Clifford nodded. "Been a long time since we saw your father. Didn't know he was still around." "He doesn't really talk about those days," Bridget said. "After Mom passed, he just kind of shut down. The bike was hers, actually. Anniversary gift. He hasn't touched it since she died." The words landed like individual stones dropping into still water, each one sending ripples through Clifford's consciousness that he couldn't quite control. He remembered now, pieces falling into place like shrapnel from an old wound working its way to the surface. Naomi, Dalton's wife, cancer. The way grief could hollow a man out until there was nothing left but breathing and the mechanical process of getting through days that all looked exactly the same. But there was more to it than that. Something Clifford had buried deep because remembering it meant facing his own failure, his own guilt, the debt he owed and had never paid. The other men at the table were watching him now, reading the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw had gone tight, the way his hands had curled into fists against the table, like he was preparing for a fight that wouldn't come. "You know him?" Waylon said, voice low enough that Bridget couldn't quite hear from where she stood. Clifford nodded once, sharp and tight. "Yeah, I know him." Fletch leaned forward slightly. "How well?" Clifford looked up at Bridget, really looked at her, and saw Dalton in the shape of her face, the color of her eyes, the way she held herself like someone who'd been carrying weight alone for too long. He owed this man, owed him in ways that couldn't be measured in money or favors, owed him in the currency of life and death, in the brotherhood they'd sworn meant something permanent. "He saved my life," Clifford said quietly. "Took a beating that was meant for me. And when his wife was dying, no, I wasn't there. None of us were." The confession sat on the table between them like something physical, something that couldn't be taken back or softened or explained away with good intentions and excuses about giving a man space to grieve. Bridget set down the coffee pot. You want his address? It wasn't a question. She could read where this was going, could see in these rough men's faces that whatever had brought them to Rosie's diner on this particular afternoon was about to take them somewhere else. Somewhere that mattered more than lunch or small talk or the casual rhythm of a Tuesday afternoon. If you're willing to give it, Clifford said. Bridget grabbed a napkin from the dispenser and pulled a pen from her apron pocket. Her handwriting was small and precise, the careful script of someone who'd learned to make things clear because clarity mattered when the stakes were high. She wrote 742 Sycamore Lane, Bakersfield, California, and handed it across the table. Her eyes met Clifford's for a moment, and in that brief connection, he saw warning and hope mixed together in equal measure. He's not the same man you remember, Bridget said quietly. Nobody who loses someone like that stays the same. Clifford took the napkin, folded it carefully, and put it in his vest pocket right over his heart. None of us are the same. That's not what matters. They left cash on the table more than the bill required and walked out into the afternoon sun. Their bikes sat waiting in the parking lot, patient and powerful machines that had carried them through decades of choices, both good and bad. Chrome gleamed in the light. Leather seats held the heat of the day. Clifford stood there for a moment, staring at his Harley, thinking about all the roads he'd ridden and all the brothers he'd left behind on them. The ones who died, the ones who quit, the ones who just faded away because nobody checked to see if they were okay. Gus came up beside him, a solid presence that had been there for 23 years through everything that mattered and most of the things that didn't. You sure about this? Gus asked. Clifford nodded. Should have done it 15 years ago. They mounted up, engines roaring to life in sequence, and the sound filled the empty parking lot like thunder rolling across flat land. 4 men on 4 machines heading toward an address that held a ghost they'd failed to save when salvation mattered most. The ride took 23 minutes through streets that had seen better days, past houses with chain-link fences and cars on blocks, past strip malls with half the storefronts empty and graffiti covering the plywood where windows used to be. The kind of neighborhood where people minded their business and kept their heads down because getting involved meant complications nobody could afford. Dalton Brennan's house sat at the end of a dead-end street, a small ranch-style place with faded blue siding and a yard that needed mowing. The paint was peeling around the window frames. The mailbox leaned at an angle like it had been hit by a car, and nobody had bothered to fix it. The driveway was cracked weeds growing through the concrete in patterns that spoke of years without maintenance. The garage door was closed, but Clifford could see through the small window on the side. Just barely. Just enough to make out the edge of a tarp covering something bike-shaped that hadn't moved in over a decade. They pulled into the driveway, killed their engines, and the sudden silence felt heavy with everything that couldn't be spoken. Cicadas buzzed in the trees. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and then went quiet. The sun beat down on the cracked asphalt, and the heat shimmered in waves that made the world look unstable. Clifford climbed off his bike, his boots crunching on gravel that had weeds growing through it, and walked up to the front door. His hand hesitated over the doorbell, doubt creeping in for the first time since they'd left the diner. What if Dalton didn't want to see him? What if 15 years was too long? What if the damage was too deep, the betrayal too complete, the abandonment too thorough to ever walk back? What if showing up now was just another way of making this about Clifford's guilt instead of Dalton's pain? He rang the doorbell anyway. Inside, he heard movement, slow and cautious. The shuffle of someone who wasn't expecting visitors and didn't want them. Footsteps approaching the door with the reluctance of a man who'd learned that people showing up unannounced usually meant problems he didn't need. The door opened a crack. Dalton Brennan looked out with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. The years had carved lines deep around his mouth, etched paths across his forehead that spoke of pain carried alone. His hair had gone almost completely gray, pulled back in a ponytail that hung limp between his shoulder blades. He was thinner than Clifford remembered, not frail exactly, but diminished. Like someone who'd learned to take up less space to avoid being seen. He wore a faded work shirt with construction company logo barely visible anymore. Jeans stained with dried concrete dust boots that had seen 1,000 job sites and not enough care. His face was weathered in the way that comes from outdoor work and not enough sleep and the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than physical. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Clifford took in the changes, cataloging the damage that 15 years of isolation had done. Dalton stared back, recognition, dawning slowly, followed by something that looked like pain and anger and resignation, all mixed together into an expression that defied easy reading. Hatchet, Dalton said finally, and his voice was rough, unused to saying names that mattered. Yeah, Clifford said. It's me. Dalton's hand tightened on the door knuckles, going white, and for a second Clifford thought he might slam it shut, might decide that whatever this was, whatever had brought his past to his doorstep on a Tuesday afternoon, wasn't worth engaging with. But he didn't. He just stood there looking at a ghost from a life he'd buried and waited. What are you doing here? Dalton asked. Clifford didn't have a good answer. Didn't have words that could bridge 15 years of silence and absence and the casual cruelty of forgetting someone who'd mattered. So he told the truth. I met your daughter today, Clifford said, at Rosie's diner. She told me about the bike, about you. Dalton's expression closed off immediately, walls going up fast and high, the defensive posture of a man who'd learned that vulnerability only led to more pain. So you came to check on the broken man, Dalton said. Make yourself feel better about moving on. The words landed like punches, and Clifford took them because he'd earned every one. Because Dalton was right. Because showing up 15 years late didn't make you a hero. It just made you someone who finally noticed you'd failed. No, Clifford said quietly. I came because I should have been here 15 years ago, and I wasn't. I came because you saved my life, and I let you disappear. I came because brotherhood is supposed to mean something, and I forgot that when it got hard. Behind Clifford, the other wolves had gotten off their bikes and were standing in a loose semicircle in the driveway. Silent witnesses to a reckoning that was 15 years overdue. Gus with his arms crossed, face unreadable. Waylon shifting his weight from foot to foot like he wanted to be anywhere else. Fletch staring at the ground like it might open up and swallow him. Dalton's jaw worked, emotions fighting for control behind his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice shook with something that sounded like rage, barely contained. You don't get to do this, Dalton said. You don't get to show up now and act like it matters. I needed you then, when she was dying, when I was trying to figure out how to keep breathing. Where were you then? The question hung in the air like smoke, and Clifford felt the full weight of it. The accusation he'd been carrying since the day he'd heard through third-hand sources that Dalton Brennan had stopped showing up to anything and had done exactly nothing about it. I was being a coward, Clifford said, and the admission cost him something. I was telling myself that you needed space when what I really meant was I didn't know how to handle watching you hurt. I was being selfish. We all were. Dalton's eyes were wet now, years of grief and abandonment spilling over like a dam that had finally cracked under pressure. It was never designed to hold. She asked about you near the end, Dalton said, and his voice broke on the words. Asked why nobody came to visit. I didn't know what to tell her. Didn't know how to explain that the men I'd bled with couldn't be bothered to sit in a hospital room. The words cut deeper than any knife. Clifford had known intellectually that his absence had hurt, had understood in the abstract that abandoning someone in their darkest hour was cruel. But hearing it like this, raw and unfiltered, and aimed directly at the heart of his failure, made it real in a way he'd been avoiding for 15 years. I'm sorry, Clifford said, and the words felt pathetically small. Inadequate, like bringing a Band-Aid to a gunshot wound. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't change what happened. But I'm sorry. Dalton wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, angry at himself for showing weakness, for caring after all this time, for letting these men back in even an inch, when they'd proven they couldn't be trusted with the important things. Sorry doesn't bring her back, Dalton said. Sorry doesn't give me back 15 years. No, Clifford agreed. It doesn't. But maybe it's a place to start. The standoff continued, two men separated by a doorway, and 15 years of accumulated pain, neither quite willing to be the first to move. Behind Clifford, a car drove slowly past the end of the street, music thumping from open windows, bass rattling loose trim, life continuing, the world not stopping for private reconciliations or old guilt finally demanding payment. Dalton looked past Clifford at the other wolves standing in his driveway. Gus raised a hand in greeting, solemn and respectful. Waylon nodded, his face showing the same guilt that Clifford carried. Fletch met Dalton's eyes and didn't look away, accepting whatever judgment was coming. These weren't men who apologized easily, who admitted mistakes, who showed vulnerability in any form that might be mistaken for weakness. But they were here, and that said something their words couldn't. "I don't know if I can do this," Dalton said quietly. "I don't know if I remember how to be that person anymore." "You don't have to be that person," Clifford said. "You just have to be you, whatever that looks like now." Dalton stood there in his doorway, torn between the safety of isolation and the terrifying possibility of letting people back in, of risking the kind of pain that comes from caring about something enough that its loss can destroy you. His hand stayed on the door for another long moment. Then slowly, reluctantly, like a man making a decision he knew he might regret, he stepped back and opened it wider. "You want to come in?" Dalton asked. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was an opening, and that was more than Clifford had any right to expect. They filed into Dalton's house, the wolves moving carefully like men aware they were walking on sacred ground. Like visitors to a shrine they'd abandoned and had no business entering now. The living room was small and clean and empty of anything that suggested a life fully lived. No photographs on the walls, no personal touches that would indicate who Dalton had been, or who he'd loved, or what mattered to him beyond basic survival. Just functional furniture arranged without thought to comfort or aesthetics. A couch that looked like it came from a thrift store. A television on a stand that predated flat screens. A coffee table with nothing on it but dust and the rings left by glasses set down and forgotten. The walls were beige. The carpet was industrial and worn. The whole space felt temporary, like a place someone was staying until something better came along, except nothing better had come along in 15 years and probably never would. They sat awkwardly, the wolves taking up space in a way that felt both intrusive and necessary. Dalton stood by the window, arms crossed, still guarded, but no longer actively hostile. The posture of a man who'd agreed to this conversation, but reserved the right to end it whenever it became too much. "Your daughter seems like a good kid," Gus said, breaking the silence because someone had to. Dalton's expression softened slightly, the first crack in his armor. "She is. She's the only reason I'm still here." The admission hung heavy in the air, the unspoken implication clear as daylight. Without Bridget, Dalton wouldn't have found a reason to keep going. That's how close they'd come to losing him completely. That's how near the edge he'd been for how long. "She mentioned the bike," Clifford said, carefully watching Dalton's face for signs he was pushing too hard too fast. "Said it's been sitting in the garage." Dalton nodded, his gaze drifting to the window that looked out on the closed garage door. "Haven't touched it since the funeral. Couldn't. Every time I looked at it, all I saw was her on the back holding on to me, like we were going somewhere that mattered." "Maybe you still are," Clifford said. Dalton shook his head. "I'm not that man anymore. That version of me died with her." "Or maybe," Clifford said slowly, "that version of you has just been waiting for a reason to come back." Dalton didn't respond, but something flickered in his eyes. Something that might have been longing mixed with fear. The possibility of hope battling against the safety of resignation. They talked for hours that afternoon. The conversation moved from painful to cautious to something almost comfortable, like old friends finding their rhythm again after too long apart. The wolves told stories about runs and rallies, about brothers who'd died, and new members who'd joined, about the way the world had changed and the way it had stayed exactly the same. Dalton listened more than he talked at first, but gradually he started contributing, adding memories that had been locked away for 15 years. Small details that proved he hadn't forgotten everything, even if he'd tried. He told them about the last ride he'd taken with Naomi just 3 months before she got sick. They'd gone up the coast, camping under stars that seemed close enough to touch. She'd told him she'd never been happier, and he'd believed her because everything about that moment felt perfect in a way that doesn't happen often enough to take for granted. He told them about the diagnosis, the way time compressed and expanded simultaneously. Every moment precious and agonizing. The doctors who spoke in percentages and timelines, like they were discussing weather patterns instead of the systematic destruction of everything that mattered. He told them about the bike sitting under that tarp in the garage, about the mornings he'd stood there and thought about starting it, about how close he'd come to turning the key and riding until he ran out of gas or courage or reasons to keep going. About the mornings he couldn't make himself do it because starting that bike meant acknowledging that she was really gone, that the passenger seat would stay empty forever, that he was riding alone now, whether he wanted to or not. The wolves listened without judgment, without trying to fix anything, just bearing witness to grief that had been carried in isolation for too long. And slowly, imperceptibly, something began to shift. Not healing exactly, not redemption or forgiveness, or any of the clean resolutions that stories promise, but life rarely delivers. Just acknowledgement. Recognition that the pain was real and the absence had mattered, and the brotherhood had failed when it counted most. But they were here now. That had to count for something. As the sun started to set, painting the living room in shades of orange and gold, Clifford's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his face changed. Went hard in a way that made the other men look up. "What is it?" Gus asked. Clifford set the phone down on the coffee table like it weighed more than it should. "Randall Tully died this morning. Heart attack. Funeral's Friday." The name hit the room like a physical presence. Randall Tully. Old Iron Wolf. A man who'd ridden with all of them at one point or another. Who'd been at Dalton's wedding. Who'd helped Clifford rebuild an engine in a parking lot during a rainstorm just because that's what brothers did. Dalton's face went pale. "Randall," Clifford nodded. "His family's asking if the wolves will ride. Full escort." Where silence settled over them, heavy with the weight of mortality and the brutal reminder that time didn't stop just because you'd stepped away from your life. That brothers kept dying, whether you were there to bury them or not. Clifford looked at Dalton, and in his eyes was a question he didn't quite know how to ask. An invitation that came with no pressure, but infinite weight. "Will you ride with us?" Clifford said quietly. "One last time, for Randall." Dalton stared at him, then at the other men sitting in his living room, then out the window at the garage that held a machine he hadn't touched in 15 years. His throat worked like he was trying to swallow something too big to fit. "I don't know if I can," Dalton said. "You don't have to know," Clifford said. "You just have to decide." The sun dropped below the horizon and shadows filled the room like water filling a space that had been empty too long. Outside, the street went quiet as the evening settled over Bakersfield like a blanket. Somewhere a screen door slammed. Somewhere a dog barked. Life continuing in all the small ways that don't make the news or change anything, but somehow add up to the texture of existence. Dalton stood by the window looking at nothing and everything, and the weight of the decision pressed down on him, like gravity suddenly remembering he existed. "When's the funeral?" he asked, and his voice was barely audible. "Friday," Clifford said. 10 in the morning, Riverside Cemetery." Dalton nodded slowly, not quite agreement, but not refusal either. Just acknowledgement that he'd heard, that the information had been received and now required processing. The wolves stood to leave, reading the moment, correctly understanding that sometimes a man needs space to make peace with ghosts, for he can decide whether to join the living again. They filed out into the driveway back to their bikes, but Clifford hung back at the door. "That bike in your garage," Clifford said. "It's still yours. And when you're ready, we'll ride with you." Dalton's throat tightened. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready." "That's okay," Clifford said. "We'll wait." He turned to go, then stopped and looked back one more time. "Your wife," Clifford said. "Naomi, she didn't just die from cancer, did she?" Dalton went very still. The question hung between them like something dangerous that had been buried and was now clawing its way to the surface. "What do you mean?" Dalton said, but his voice had changed. Gone flat in a way that meant he knew exactly what Clifford meant. Clifford had been thinking about it since Bridget mentioned the timeline, since the pieces had started falling into place in ways that didn't quite add up unless you knew what to look for. "You were with us," Clifford said. "March 2010, the run to Riverside, the thing with Devil's Chain." Dalton's face confirmed it before his words did. "She collapsed while I was gone," Dalton said, and the words came out like broken glass. 3 hours away, by the time I got home, the cancer had already spread to stage 4. The doctor said if they'd caught it earlier, if she'd gone in when the symptoms first started, instead of waiting for me to get back. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to voice the conclusion that had been eating at him for 15 years. "You blamed us," Clifford said quietly. "You blamed the brotherhood for keeping you away when she needed you." Dalton didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either, just stood there with 15 years of accumulated guilt and rage written across his face in lines that would never fully fade. "She asked about you," Dalton said finally. "In the hospital. Near the end." "Where are the wolves?" she said. "Where are your brothers? Why isn't anyone here?" The words hit Clifford like bullets, each one finding its mark with the precision of someone who'd been aiming for 15 years. "You never told us that," Clifford said. Dalton's laugh was bitter. "You never asked. You never called. You never showed up. You gave me space. That's what you called it. Space. His voice broke on the word, and Clifford saw the raw wound that had never healed. The abandonment that had cut deeper than any grief because it had come from the men who'd sworn that brotherhood meant something permanent, something that couldn't be eroded by inconvenience or discomfort or the awkwardness of not knowing what to say to a man whose world was ending. We failed you, Clifford said, and there was no excuse attached to the statement. No justification, just the flat acknowledgement of truth. We failed you when it mattered, and I'm sorry, doesn't begin to cover it. No, Dalton agreed, it doesn't. They stood there in the doorway as darkness settled fully over the street. Two men separated by choices made and not made by presence and absence, by the difference between the brotherhood they'd promised and the reality they'd delivered. But maybe, Clifford said, maybe it's not too late to do better. Dalton looked at him for a long moment, weighing 15 years of pain against the possibility that redemption might be real. Friday, Dalton said finally. 10 in the morning. Friday, Dalton said finally. 10 in the morning. Clifford nodded. We'll be here at 8 if you want to ride with us. He walked back to his bike, climbed on, and started the engine. The others followed suit, and the four Harleys rumbled to life in the quiet residential street. They pulled out slowly, respectfully, engines throttled low, and rode off into the night. Dalton stood in his doorway and watched them go. Watched the taillights disappear around the corner. Watched the street return to its normal quiet, like nothing had happened. But something had happened. For the first time in 15 years, Dalton Brennan wasn't alone with his grief. For the first time since Naomi died, someone had shown up and refused to let him disappear. For the first time since he'd covered that bike with a tarp and walked away from the life he used to live there, was a reason to think about uncovering it. He closed the door and stood in his empty living room, listening to the silence that had been his only companion for longer than he cared to remember. Then slowly, like a man making a decision that terrified him, he walked to the garage door and put his hand on the knob. He didn't turn it. Not yet. But the intention was there. The possibility. The first crack in the wall he'd built between himself and the world. In the driveway outside, Bridget's car pulled in. She'd finished her second shift at the grocery store, and she was tired in the way that comes from working two jobs and carrying a responsibility that should have been shared, but wasn't. She found her father standing by the garage door, and something in his posture made her stop. "Dad," she said carefully, "you okay?" Dalton turned to look at her, and in his eyes was something she hadn't seen in 15 years. Not hope exactly, but maybe the memory of what hope used to feel like. "They came," he said. "Hatchet and the others. They came." Bridget set down her bag and walked over to him. Put her hand on his arm. "I know, I gave them the address." Dalton nodded slowly. "There's a funeral Friday. Randall Tully. They want me to ride with them." "Are you going to?" Bridget asked, and she was careful to keep her voice neutral. Not pushing, not pulling, just asking. Dalton looked at the garage door, at the space that held a machine he'd loved and abandoned in equal measure. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Part of me wants to. Part of me thinks it's too late, that too much time has passed, that I'm not that person anymore." "And what does the rest of you think?" Bridget asked. Dalton was quiet for a long time. Then so softly, she almost didn't hear it, he said the thing he'd been afraid to admit for 15 years. "The rest of me thinks maybe your mother would want me to try." Bridget squeezed his arm, tears in her eyes that she didn't bother to hide. "I think she would too." They stood there together in the hallway, father and daughter, survivors of a grief that had nearly consumed them both, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence between them didn't feel quite so heavy. In the garage behind the closed door, under a tarp that had been there so long, it had become part of the landscape, a 2009 Harley-Davidson Fat Boy waited, patient as only a machine can be, ready or not ready, just waiting. And somewhere in the darkness of that enclosed space, in the dust, in the stillness, in the absence of sound, Naomi Brennan's lipstick mark was still there on the gas tank, faded but present. A kiss placed before a final ride that neither of them knew would be the last. The bike remembered, even if the man had tried to forget. And Friday was coming, whether Dalton Brennan was ready or not. The kitchen light cast harsh shadows across the table where Bridget sat, with something small and folded clutched between her fingers. It was past midnight, and the house had that particular quality of silence that comes in the hours when most people are asleep and the world feels like it belongs only to insomniacs and those carrying burdens too heavy to set down even temporarily. Dalton stood in the doorway still wearing the clothes he had had on when the wolves left hours ago. He hadn't been able to sleep, hadn't even tried. Instead, he'd been sitting in the dark living room, staring at nothing, thinking about Friday and funerals and decisions that felt impossible but somehow had to be made anyway. When he'd gotten up to get water, he'd found Bridget at the table, and the look on her face told him this wasn't a coincidence. She'd been waiting, building up courage for something. Can't sleep either, Dalton said, moving to the sink and filling a glass. Bridget shook her head. Been thinking about what happened today, about those men who came. They're good men, Dalton said automatically, then stopped himself. We're good men. I don't know what they are now. Bridget unfolded the paper she'd been holding, and Dalton saw it was old, yellowed at the edges, the kind of thing that had been kept safe for a very long time. She slid it across the table toward him. You were going to do it, she said quietly, weren't you? Dalton looked at the paper and his blood went cold. He recognized his own handwriting, recognized the date at the top, September 2022. 3 years ago, a lifetime ago, yesterday. Where did you find that, he asked, and his voice came out rough, Garage Bridget said. Under the seat of the bike. I went out there about 6 months ago. I don't know why. Just felt like I needed to see it, and I found this. The suicide note was short, only a few lines. Instructions for Bridget about the house and his life insurance, and how to contact his brother in Oregon, who he hadn't spoken to in a decade. An apology that didn't begin to cover the scope of what he'd been planning. A single line that broke his heart to read now in the unforgiving, fluorescent light of the kitchen. You deserve better than a father who stopped living 15 years ago. Bridget's eyes were wet, but her voice stayed steady. Every day for how long, Dad? How long were you thinking about it? 2 years, Dalton said, and sitting down felt like surrender, but he couldn't keep standing. Every single day for 2 years, I thought about it. Some days it was just a whisper. Some days it was the only thing I could think about. But you didn't, Bridget said. Dalton looked at his daughter and saw Naomi in the curve of her cheek and the way she held herself when she was scared, but refusing to show it. Saw the strength that had kept her going through a childhood that should have been lighter, easier, filled with more joy and less responsibility. You're the only reason I didn't, he said. Every time I got close, I'd think about you finding me, about what it would do to you, and I couldn't. I couldn't do that to you. The words hung between them, honest and terrible and necessary. Bridget reached across the table and took his hand. Her grip was strong, the fingers of someone who'd worked hard jobs and carried heavy things and refused to break even when breaking would have been easier. I need to show you something, she said. She stood and left the room, returning a moment later with an envelope. This one was different from the suicide note, cream-colored and formal, the kind used for important occasions. Dalton's name was written on the front in handwriting he recognized instantly, even though he hadn't seen it in 15 years. Naomi's handwriting. His hand shook as he reached for it. She gave it to me, Bridget said, 3 days before she died. Made me promise not to give it to you until you were ready. I've been carrying it for 15 years, Dad, waiting for the right moment. I think maybe this is it. Dalton held the envelope like it might dissolve if he gripped too hard. He could feel the weight of the paper inside. Could imagine Naomi writing it in a hospital bed knowing she was dying, trying to find words that would reach across the gulf of death and grief to the man she loved. Read it, Bridget said gently. Dalton's fingers trembled as he opened the envelope. The letter inside was written on both sides of a single sheet, the handwriting getting shakier toward the end as Naomi's strength had failed. But every word was legible. Every word was her. My Danny, it began, and Dalton's vision blurred immediately. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you survived long enough for Bridget to think you might be ready to hear what I have to say. I hope that's true. I hope you're not just surviving anymore, but actually living, though. Knowing you the way I do, I suspect you've been making yourself smaller for years, trying to disappear into your own grief. Don't do that, my love. Please don't do that. The bike I gave you for your 40th birthday wasn't just a present. It was a promise of freedom and adventure and all the roads we were going to ride together. We got some of those roads, Danny. We got more happiness than most people find in a whole lifetime. And I'm grateful for every mile. But I'm gone now and you're still here and that bike is sitting somewhere gathering dust because you think riding it without me would be a betrayal. It wouldn't be, it would be the opposite. I need you to understand something, and I need you to believe me when I say it, because I'm not going to be there to remind you. What happened to me wasn't your fault. I know you, Danny. I know you've been blaming yourself for not being there when I collapsed, for being with your brothers when I needed you, for choosing the club over me that weekend. You didn't choose anything, my love. I chose to wait to see a doctor because I was scared of what they might find. I chose to ignore symptoms because acknowledging them meant facing my own mortality, and I wasn't ready. By the time you got home, the cancer had already spread, and that was my doing, not yours. The brotherhood you rode with, they're flawed men, selfish sometimes, absent when they should be present. But they loved you, Danny. In their imperfect way, they loved you. And I don't want you to lose that because of me. If you're reading this, it means enough time has passed that Bridget thinks you might be ready to hear what comes next. So here it is, the thing I need you to do for me. Live, Danny. Really live. Not just breathe and work and go through motions. Actually live. Ride that bike. Feel the wind. Remember what freedom tastes like. Let people in even when it's scary, and especially when it's scary. Forgive yourself for whatever you think you did wrong. Forgive the brothers who failed to show up. Forgive the world for being unfair and brutal and beautiful all at once. And Danny, if the darkness gets too heavy, if you find yourself thinking about ending it, I need you to remember something. You dying won't bring me back. It'll just mean we both lost. And I didn't fight as hard as I did to stay alive so you could waste the life you still have. I love you. I loved you from the moment I met you until the moment I stopped breathing, and I'll love you in whatever comes after. But that love doesn't chain you to the past. It sets you free to have a future. So ride my love. Ride for both of us. Ride until you remember what joy feels like. Ride until the grief doesn't crush you anymore. Ride until you find yourself again. And when you do know that I'm proud of you, know that I'm with you. Know that every mile you put behind you is a mile toward healing. And healing isn't betrayal. It's survival. It's honor. It's love. Yours always, Naomi. Dalton read the letter 3 times before he could see clearly enough to look up. Tears streamed down his face, unchecked, and his chest felt like something had cracked open inside it. Not breaking, opening, like a door that had been locked for 15 years finally swinging wide. She knew, he whispered. She knew I'd blame myself. Of course she knew, Bridget said, and she was crying too now. She knew you better than anyone. Dalton folded the letter carefully, reverently, like it was the most precious thing in the world. Which it was. Which it might always be. The last words from the woman he'd loved more than breathing. I can't ride to Randall's funeral, he said. I don't remember how to be that man anymore. Then learn again, Bridget said. You've got 2 days. Dalton looked at his daughter and saw strength he didn't feel, saw certainty he couldn't claim, saw the future she was offering him if he was brave enough to take it. I don't know how, he admitted. Bridget stood and held out her hand. Start with the garage. They walked together through the dark house to the door Dalton had been avoiding for 15 years. His hand hesitated on the knob the same way it had earlier when the wolves had left. But this time Bridget was beside him, and her presence made the impossible feel slightly less impossible. He turned the knob and pushed the door open. The garage smelled like dust and motor oil and time standing still. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak yellow light that barely reached the corners. Tools lined the walls on pegboards, organized the way Dalton used to keep them when he cared about such things. A workbench sat against the back wall, surface clean, except for a thin layer of grime that comes from years without use. And in the center, under a heavy canvas tarp, sat the shape that had haunted Dalton's peripheral vision for 15 years. The bike. Bridget moved to help him, but Dalton shook his head. This was something he needed to do himself. His hands found the edge of the tarp, and he pulled. The canvas came away slowly, reluctantly, like it had grown attached to what it covered. Dust rose in clouds that caught the light and made both of them cough. But underneath, gleaming dully in the weak illumination, was the Harley-Davidson Fat Boy that Naomi had given him for his 40th birthday. Vivid black paint now dulled with dust, chrome that had lost its shine but was still intact. The anniversary model with the contrast-cut wheels that Naomi had special ordered because she knew Dalton had always wanted them but would never buy them for himself. Dalton stood there staring at it, and memories crashed over him like waves. The day Naomi had brought him out here with her hands over his eyes. The look on her face when she'd revealed it. The way she'd climbed on the back for their first ride and whispered in his ear that she'd never felt more alive. The last ride they'd taken together 3 months before the diagnosis. Up the Pacific Coast Highway, with the ocean on one side and cliffs on the other, and Naomi's arms wrapped around him like she could hold them both to the moment forever. He circled the bike, slowly cataloging the damage that time had done. Flat tires, obviously. The battery would be dead. Fluids would need to be changed. The fuel in the tank had probably turned to varnish by now. It would take work to bring it back. Real work. The kind that required commitment and follow-through and caring about whether something lived or died. But it was possible. The bike wasn't destroyed, just neglected, just forgotten, just waiting for someone to remember it mattered. Like me, Dalton thought, and the parallel wasn't lost on him. "Can you fix it?" Bridget asked. Dalton ran his hand over the gas tank, feeling the texture of dust under his palm. And then his fingers found something else, something smooth and slightly raised. He leaned closer, using his sleeve to wipe away the grime, and his breath caught. There on the tank, faded but unmistakable, was the outline of lips. Naomi's lipstick mark from that last ride. She'd kissed the bike before they'd left, laughing about leaving her mark on his other great love. He'd meant to clean it off and never had, and somehow it had survived 15 years of dust and neglect and time trying to erase everything that mattered. "Oh God," Dalton whispered, and the grief that hit him was overwhelming. He sank to his knees beside the bike, one hand still on the tank, feeling the ghost of his wife's kiss under his fingers, and something inside him shattered. Not broke, shattered. Into pieces small enough that they might actually be able to heal, instead of just sitting there jagged and wrong forever. He cried the way he hadn't cried since the funeral. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere so deep he'd forgotten that part of himself existed. Bridget knelt beside him and wrapped her arms around her father, and they stayed like that for a long time in the dusty garage with the bike between them, like a monument to everything they'd lost and everything they might still save. When Dalton could finally breathe again, when the tears had slowed enough that he could speak, he looked at Bridget and saw Naomi and saw the future all at once. "I can fix it," he said. "I don't know if I can fix myself, but I can fix this." "That's a start," Bridget said. They worked until 3 in the morning that first night. Dalton showed Bridget how to check the oil, how to examine the tires for cracks and dry rot, how to test connections and assess damage. His hands remembered things his mind had tried to forget. The muscle memory of maintenance and care, and the relationship between a rider and his machine. The tires were shot unsalvageable. The battery was dead as expected. The fuel system would need to be completely flushed. But the engine itself looked intact. The chrome under the dust still held its integrity. The frame was solid. This was salvageable. They were salvageable. When they finally called it a night, Dalton stood in the garage doorway and looked back at the bike. It sat there in the weak light, half covered in parts and tools, and the evidence of work begun, and for the first time in 15 years, it looked less like a monument to the dead and more like a project for the living. "Tomorrow," Dalton said. "We'll start again tomorrow." The next morning, Dalton woke to the sound of motorcycles in his driveway. For a confused moment, he thought he was dreaming, but the rumble of Harley engines was too real, too present, too unmistakably there. He stumbled to the window and looked out to see Clifford Vance climbing off his bike with a toolbox in one hand and a determined expression on his weathered face. Dalton opened the front door before Clifford could ring the bell. "What are you doing here?" "Heard you might need some help with a fat boy that's been sitting for a while," Clifford said. "Figured I know fat boys. Thought I'd offer." Behind him, Gus was unloading a battery from his saddlebag, a new one still in the packaging. Waylon carried motor oil and filters. Fletch had a set of tires strapped to the back of his bike. "You don't have to do this," Dalton said. "I know," Clifford replied. "That's why I'm doing it." They worked all morning in the garage, 4 men who'd forgotten how to talk to each other but still remembered how to work together. There was something meditative about the process, the removal of old parts, the installation of new ones, the systematic restoration of function to something that had sat broken for too long. Dalton found himself relaxing into the rhythm of it. Clifford knew fat boys the way he'd claimed, and his hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd rebuilt engines in parking lots and driveways across 3 decades of riding. Gus handled the electrical work with patience that bordered on obsessive. Wayland did the grunt work of draining and flushing the fuel system without complaint. They didn't talk much at first. The work spoke for itself. Pass me that wrench. Hold this steady. Check that connection. The language of mechanics and brotherhood that predated words and would outlast them. But gradually, as the morning wore into afternoon, conversation began to flow. Carefully at first. Safely. Stories about other bikes they'd worked on. Runs they'd taken decades ago when they were younger and more reckless and convinced of their own immortality. Gus told a story about the time he'd blown a tire doing 90 on the interstate and somehow managed to bring the bike down without dying. Wayland admitted he'd once run out of gas in the middle of nowhere and had to push his Harley 3 miles to the nearest station. Fletch confessed to crashing into a fence while trying to impress a woman who turned out to already have a boyfriend. The stories were safe, surface level, but they were also connection. Proof that these men still existed beyond the grief and failure that had defined their relationship for 15 years. Around noon, Bridget came out with sandwiches and coffee. She called in sick to both her jobs, claiming a family emergency that wasn't exactly a lie. The men ate in the driveway, sitting on upturned crates in the tailgate of Dalton's old truck. And for a moment, it almost felt like old times, almost. "Your daughter's good people," Gus said to Dalton when Bridget had gone back inside. "She's the best thing I ever did," Dalton replied. "Only thing I didn't completely mess up." "You didn't mess up," Clifford said. "You survived. There's a difference. Doesn't feel like it," Dalton said. "Never does," Clifford agreed. "That's why it counts." They went back to work. By mid-afternoon, the bike was starting to look like something that might actually run again. Fresh oil in the engine, new battery connected, clean fuel in the tank, tires mounted and inflated, all the connections tested and verified. The moment of truth came around 4 o'clock when Dalton sat on the bike for the first time in 15 years. The leather seat cracked under his weight, protesting years of disuse. The handlebars felt foreign and familiar all at once. His feet found the pegs, automatically muscle memory overriding conscious thought. He put his hands on the grips and closed his eyes, and for a moment he could feel Naomi behind him. Phantom weight against his back, phantom arms around his waist, her breath on his neck and her laugh in his ear, and the absolute certainty that everything was going to be okay because they were together. Then he opened his eyes and she was gone, and he was alone on a bike in a garage surrounded by men who'd failed him and shown up anyway. "Turn the key," Clifford said quietly. Dalton's hand moved to the ignition. The key was still there, dusty but intact. He turned it, and the electrical system came to life. Lights flickered on. The fuel pump primed with a soft whir. "Hit the starter," Gus said. Dalton's thumb found the button. He held his breath and pressed. The engine coughed once, protested, sputtered like it was offended by the very suggestion that it should work after 15 years of silence. He tried again. Another cough. A wheeze, the sound of something that wanted to live but had forgotten how. "Third time," Fletch said. Always the third time. Dalton pressed the starter again, and this time the engine caught. It roared to life with a sound that filled the garage like resurrection, deep and powerful and unmistakably alive. The rumble resonated in Dalton's chest, vibrating through the frame and into his bones, and something that had been frozen inside him for 15 years started to thaw. He sat there with the engine running, tears streaming down his face that he didn't bother to hide, and let himself feel everything he'd been avoiding. The grief, the loss, the anger at being left behind, the guilt at it still being alive when Naomi wasn't. And underneath all of it, fragile and terrifying and absolutely real, something that might have been hope. The other men stood back and watched and said nothing. This moment didn't belong to them. This was Dalton's resurrection, and all they could do was witness it. After a long moment, Dalton killed the engine. The silence that followed felt different from the silence of before. Fuller somehow, pregnant with possibility. "She runs," he said, and his voice was rough. "She runs," Clifford confirmed. Dalton climbed off the bike on shaky legs and stood there, looking at what they'd accomplished in a single day. A machine brought back from the dead, a promise kept 15 years late, a door opening onto a future he'd stopped believing in. "Thank you," he said to the men standing in his garage. "For this, for coming back, for not giving up even when I did." "We failed you once," Clifford said. "We're trying not to fail you again." That night, after the wolves had gone and Bridget had headed to her evening shift at the grocery store, Dalton sat alone in the garage with the bike. The work wasn't done. There were still adjustments to make, fluids to check, systems to test. But the hardest part was over. The bike lived again. The question was whether he could do the same. He thought about Naomi's letter, about her instruction to ride for both of them, about the lipstick mark on the tank that had survived 15 years and might as well have been a message written specifically for this moment. He thought about Randall Tully's funeral tomorrow, about the brotherhood that would be there, about the choice he'd been avoiding since Clifford had shown up at his door. Ride or hide, live or just survive. Choose the terror of hope or the safety of resignation. It wasn't really a choice at all. Dalton stood and walked to the corner of the garage where his old riding gear hung on hooks, dusty and forgotten. Leather vest with the iron wolves patches still intact. Boots that had walked through rain and dust and the miles between youth and middle age. Gloves with the fingers worn thin from gripping handlebars. He pulled the vest down and shook the dust off. Tried it on. It still fit, though his body had changed underneath. Less muscle, more wear. But the leather remembered the shape of him, and wearing it felt like putting on a version of himself he'd buried. In the pocket, his fingers found something he'd forgotten about. A photograph, old and creased. Him and Naomi on the bike, taken by someone at a rally years ago. They were both laughing, her arms around his waist, the sun setting behind them in a blaze of orange and gold. They looked young, invincible, absolutely certain that moments like that would last forever. Dalton stared at the photograph for a long time. Then carefully, with shaking hands, he propped it up on the workbench where he could see it. Not hiding anymore. Not locked away in a box. Just there. Present. A reminder of what had been and what might still be possible. Tomorrow, he said to the empty garage. To Naomi's ghost. To himself. Tomorrow I ride. Friday morning came cold and clear, the kind of California autumn day where the sky looks painted on, and the air carries just enough chill to remind you that seasons change whether you're ready or not. Dalton woke at 5:30 without an alarm. Couldn't have slept past 6 if he'd wanted to. The anxiety and anticipation had been building in his chest all night, making rest impossible, making the hours drag like they were moving through something thicker than time. He showered and shaved and dressed in his riding gear with the careful deliberation of a man preparing for something that mattered. The leather vest fit better than it should have after 15 years. The boots required some breaking in again, the leather stiff from disuse. But piece by piece, he put himself back together into the person he used to be. Or some version of that person anyway. Changed but not destroyed. Damaged but possibly healing. Bridget was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and worry written across her face. She'd taken the day off from both jobs, telling her managers she had a family obligation that couldn't be moved. Which was true. Which was maybe the most important true thing that had happened in their family for a very long time. You look good, Dad, she said, and her voice had tears in it, even though her eyes stayed dry. I feel terrified, Dalton admitted. That's how you know it matters, Bridget replied. They sat together in the pre-dawn quiet, not talking much, just being present for each other, in the way that families do when words aren't enough. Dalton drank his coffee and tried not to think too hard about what came next. Tried not to let the anxiety spiral into panic. Tried to remember Naomi's words about living instead of just surviving. At 7:45, the sound of motorcycles announced the arrival of the Iron Wolves. Dalton's hands started shaking immediately. The coffee cup rattled against the saucer when he set it down. Bridget stood and came around the table. She put her hands on her father's shoulders and looked him in the eyes with an intensity that demanded his full attention. Mom told you to ride, she said. So ride. For her, for yourself, for the man you used to be, and the man you might still become. Dalton nodded, not trusting his voice. And Dad, Bridget added, if you need to turn back, if this is too much, that's okay too. Trying counts, showing up counts. He stood and pulled his daughter into a hug that lasted longer than either of them expected. When they separated, Dalton walked to the garage and hit the button that raised the door. Morning light flooded in, revealing the Harley waiting there like a promise. He rolled it out into the driveway where the other bikes sat, and the sound of the wheels on concrete felt like the first steps of a journey he'd thought was over. Clifford climbed off his bike and walked over. He looked at Dalton, really looked, reading the fear and determination mixed together in equal parts. "You ready for this?" Clifford asked. "No," Dalton said honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." "Good man," Clifford said, and there was pride in his voice. Real pride, the kind that comes from watching someone do something difficult because it's necessary even when every instinct says to run. The formation took shape naturally. Clifford in front as road captain, Dalton directly behind him in the position of honor. Gus and Waylon flanking, Fletch bringing up the rear. 5 bikes ready to ride in the kind of tight formation that speaks of years riding together of trust, built through miles and experience, and the knowledge that these men would hold the line when it mattered. Dalton threw his leg over the fat boy and settled into the seat. His hands found the grips. His feet found the pegs. Every movement, automatic and foreign at the same time, like trying to speak a language you'd forgotten you knew. He turned the key. The engine fired immediately, that deep Harley rumble filling the morning air. The vibration moved through him, and for a second he was 25 again, riding for the first time, feeling like he'd found the thing that made sense in a world that mostly didn't. Clifford's bike roared to life. Then Gus's, then Waylon's, then Fletch's. 5 engines in harmony, a symphony of power and purpose, and men who'd chosen this life, knowing it came with costs they couldn't always predict. Bridget stood in the doorway watching, and Dalton caught her eye one last time. She raised her hand in a wave that was also a blessing. Permission to go, permission to live, permission to honor the past by building a future. Clifford pulled out slowly, rolling forward into the street. Dalton followed, and the bike moved beneath him, like it had been waiting for this moment for 15 years. The balance came back immediately. The feel of the throttle, the way the machine responded to pressure and intention. They rolled through Dalton's neighborhood at low speed, respecting the residential streets, engines throttled down but still present. People looked out windows at the small pack of bikers passing through, and Dalton wondered what they saw. Old men on expensive toys, remnants of a culture that didn't quite fit in the modern world. Rebels without causes who'd grown gray without growing up. Or maybe they saw what Dalton was starting to feel. Freedom, brotherhood. The choice to live deliberately instead of just drifting through days that all looked the same. They hit the main road and Clifford opened it up. Speed built gradually, the pack moving as one, synchronized in ways that came from experience and trust. 30 miles per hour, 40, 50. The wind started to push against Dalton's chest and he leaned into it, remembering how. The fear was still there. The grief hadn't gone anywhere. But underneath those familiar weights, something else was starting to emerge. Something that felt dangerously close to joy. They rode through Bakersfield as the city woke up, past strip malls just opening for business, past schools where buses were starting their routes, past the construction sites where Dalton had spent 15 years breaking his body for paychecks that barely covered the bills. The city fell away and the highway opened up. Clifford took them north on 99 heading toward Riverside, and the pack settled into the rhythm of long-distance riding. Not racing, not showing off, just moving together through space and time with intention and purpose. Dalton's back started to ache after the first 20 minutes. Muscles he hadn't used in 15 years protesting the position and the vibration and the sustained effort. His hands cramped on the grips. His legs felt stiff and uncertain on the pegs. But he didn't stop, didn't pull over, didn't give in to the voice in his head that said this was too hard, too much, too late. He just rode. They passed a cemetery about 40 minutes in, not the one where they were headed, but another one smaller and older. Dalton's eyes found it automatically drawn to the familiar sight of headstones arranged in neat rows like soldiers at attention. His hand lifted off the grip for just a moment, a gesture of acknowledgement. A salute to Naomi and all the miles they'd never ride together. A promise that he was trying, that he hadn't forgotten, that loving her didn't mean dying with her. Clifford saw it in his mirrors and understood. He didn't slow down or acknowledge it directly, just kept riding, giving Dalton space to have his moment without making it into something that required explanation or comfort or anything beyond silent witness. The miles accumulated. 10, 20, 30, each one a small victory. Each one proof that Dalton Brennan was still here, still capable, still choosing to participate in his own life instead of just watching it pass by. Around mile 35, panic hit. It came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Dalton's chest tightened, his breathing went shallow. The rational part of his brain knew he was having a panic attack, knew it would pass, knew he just needed to breathe and wait it out. But the irrational part was louder. The irrational part was screaming that he was going to crash, that he couldn't do this, that he should have stayed home where it was safe and small and didn't require anything from him except continued existence. He signaled and pulled off onto the shoulder, killed the engine, sat there on the bike with his head down and his hands shaking, trying to remember how to breathe. The other bikes pulled over behind him. Engines went quiet. Clifford walked up and stood beside the fat boy, not touching, just present. "Can't do this," Dalton said, and his voice came out strangled. "I thought I could, but I can't." Clifford didn't argue, didn't tell him he was wrong or being weak or disappointing anyone, just stood there and let Dalton have his moment. "She died because I chose you over her," Dalton said, and the words came out like they'd been locked behind his teeth for 15 years. "That run to Riverside, the thing with Devil's Chain, I should have been home. Should have been there when she collapsed. But I chose the Brotherhood instead, and she paid the price." The guilt spilled out in waves, and Clifford took it all. Listened without defending himself or the club or the choices any of them had made. When Dalton finally ran out of words, Clifford spoke quietly. "She died because cancer doesn't care who you choose or where you are. She died because cells divide wrong and bodies fail and the universe doesn't ask permission before it takes things that matter." "That doesn't make it hurt less," Dalton said. "No," Clifford agreed. "It doesn't. But blaming yourself doesn't honor her memory. Living half a life doesn't bring her back. All it does is make sure you both lose." Dalton looked up at the man who'd brought him back to this moment, who'd shown up 15 years too late and refused to apologize for being there anyway. "She'd die again seeing you like this," Clifford said. "Half alive, blaming yourself. Convinced that grief is loyalty and suffering is love. That's not what she wanted. You know it's not." A car pulled up behind them and Dalton saw a young rider climb off. Maddox Rourke, the new blood, the kid who didn't fully understand why an old bike and old men mattered, but who'd shown up anyway. Maddox walked over with the kind of confidence that only comes from not yet knowing how many ways life can break you. "My old man left when I was 6, Maddox said without preamble. "Just walked out one day and never came back. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone." Dalton looked at the young man, not seeing where this was going. "Found the MC when I was 24. Maddox continued. "Was living in my car, working 3 jobs, convinced I didn't need anyone because everyone leaves eventually anyway. These men took me in, fed me, gave me a place to crash. Taught me that family isn't the one you're born into, it's the one you choose." He gestured at the other wolves. "They're not perfect. They fail sometimes. They make mistakes, but you know what they do that my actual father never did. They show up, they keep showing up, even when it's hard, even when they don't know what to say, even when showing up is all they can offer." Dalton felt something shift in his chest, some perspective he hadn't been able to find on his own. "Brotherhood isn't about never failing," Maddox said. "It's about coming back after you fail, about trying again even when you got it wrong the first time. These men failed you 15 years ago, but they're here now. That counts for something." The words hung in the air, simple and true and impossible to argue with. Dalton looked at Clifford, at Gus and Waylon and Fletch standing beside their bikes, at Maddox with his youth and his certainty and his hard-earned wisdom about what family actually means. Then he looked down the road toward Riverside, toward Randall Tully's funeral, toward the choice that had brought him to the shoulder on this highway on this morning. Ride or hide, try or quit. Honor Naomi's last request or let the grief win. He reached down and turned the key. The fat boy's engine roared back to life. "Let's ride," he said. They mounted up and pulled back onto the highway, and this time when speed built and wind pushed and miles accumulated, Dalton let himself feel it, let himself be present for it, let himself remember that being alive meant more than just breathing. It meant choosing. It meant trying. It meant showing up even when every cell in your body was screaming to hide. It meant riding. The cemetery at Riverside stretched across 12 acres of manicured grass and old oak trees that had witnessed more grief than any living thing should have to carry. Headstones marched in neat rows toward a horizon that seemed impossibly far away, each one marking a life that had mattered to someone somewhere at some point in time. When the Iron Wolves pulled through the gates, there were already close to 200 motorcycles parked in designated areas. The sound of their arrival added to the rumble that filled the air like distant thunder, and heads turned to watch as Clifford led the small pack toward an open space near the main pavilion. Dalton killed his engine and sat for a moment gathering himself. His body ached from the ride. His hands were stiff from gripping the handlebars. His back felt like someone had been working it over with a hammer. But he'd made it. Against every instinct that told him to turn back, against the panic and the grief and the voice in his head that said he didn't belong here anymore, he'd made it. He climbed off the fat boy on legs that threatened to buckle, and Gus was there immediately steadying him with a hand on his elbow. "Easy, Ghost," Gus said, using the old road name like it still fit. "You made the ride. Take a minute." Around them, bikers in leather and patches gathered in clusters, talking in low voices about Randall Tully and the life he'd lived. Old men with gray beards and younger ones trying to earn their place. Women who rode their own bikes and others who preferred the passenger seat. A whole culture that Dalton had walked away from 15 years ago, still here, still riding, still burying their brothers when death came calling. Clifford appeared at Dalton's shoulder. "Tully's family wants the wolves to lead the procession to the gravesite. You up for that?" Dalton looked toward the pavilion where Randall's casket sat surrounded by flowers and photographs. He could see the family gathered there, faces he half recognized from decades ago when he'd been part of this world. Randall's widow, his children grown now with families of their own, his grandchildren who would grow up hearing stories about a man they'd barely known. "Yeah," Dalton said, "I'm up for it." They walked together toward the pavilion, 5 Iron Wolves moving as a unit through the crowd. People noticed. Conversations paused. Eyes tracked their movement with the kind of attention that comes from recognizing something unusual. Because Dalton Brennan was a ghost, and ghosts weren't supposed to walk around in daylight at funerals. An older man stepped into their path, and it took Dalton a moment to recognize him. Irving Aldridge, Tank they'd called him back in the day, built like his road name suggested, and just as hard to stop when he got moving. "Ghost," Tank said, and his voice carried disbelief. "That really you?" Dalton nodded. "Been a while, Tank." 15 years, Tank said. "We thought you were dead, or close enough to it that it didn't matter." The words should have stung, but Dalton found he couldn't argue with them. "That's about right," he admitted. "Been close enough to dead that it didn't matter." Tank's expression shifted from shock to something that might have been understanding. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled Dalton into a hug, hard and brief and completely sincere. "Good to see you breathing, brother," Tank said when he stepped back. "Real good." Others came forward then, men Dalton had ridden with decades ago, names and faces swimming up from memory like debris from a shipwreck, each one expressing surprise, relief, sometimes joy at seeing him alive and present. And with each interaction, Dalton felt a little more real, a little more like he actually existed in the world instead of just haunting the edges of his own life. The service started at 10 sharp. Randall's oldest son spoke about his father's love of the open road and the brotherhood that had defined so much of his life. A minister said words about heaven and peace and rest from earthly troubles. The widow stood stoic and dry-eyed, the kind of strength that comes from knowing grief was coming and preparing for it, even though preparation never helps as much as you think it will. But it was near the end when Randall's younger son took the podium that Dalton's world tilted. "My father had many regrets," the son said, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. Things he wished he'd done differently, people he wished he'd stayed in touch with. But there was one that haunted him more than all the others combined. He paused, scanning the crowd until his eyes found Dalton standing with the wolves. "Dalton Brennan," the son said. "My father spent the last 10 years of his life trying to find you, calling old numbers that didn't work anymore, reaching out to anyone who might know where you'd gone. He wanted to tell you he was sorry. Sorry he wasn't there when your wife died. Sorry the brotherhood failed you when you needed it most." The words landed like physical blows, and Dalton felt Clifford's hand on his shoulder steadying him. "Dad wrote you letters," the son continued. "Dozens of them. Never sent them because he did not know where to send them, but they're all here." He held up a wooden box, simple and worn. "Mom wanted you to have these. Wanted you to know you weren't forgotten. That Dad carried his failure with him until the day he died." After the service, Randall's widow pressed the box into Dalton's hands. Her eyes were red, but her voice was clear. "He loved you like a brother," she said, "and he never forgave himself for abandoning you. Maybe these will help you understand that you mattered, that your absence created a hole none of us knew how to fill. Dalton took the box throat too tight to speak and nodded his thanks. The procession to the gravesite was everything Clifford had promised. The Iron Wolves led riding in tight formation at walking pace, while the hearse followed and 200 other bikes brought up the rear. The sound was overwhelming, a rolling thunder that announced to the world that Randall Tully had mattered, that his death left a mark that his brothers would see him to his final rest with all the ceremony and respect they could muster. Dalton rode directly behind Clifford, the box of letters secured in his saddlebag, and felt the weight of it like a physical presence. Evidence that he hadn't been the only one carrying guilt, that the silence had hurt on both sides, that abandonment was a two-way street and everyone involved had paid a price. That night back in Bakersfield, Dalton sat alone in his garage and opened the box. Inside were 43 letters, all addressed to him at an old address he hadn't lived at in 20 years, all undelivered, all carrying Randall Tully's attempt to bridge a gap that had grown too wide to cross with just words. He read them one by one, and they told a story of regret and longing and the slow realization that brotherhood required maintenance, that it couldn't survive on good intentions alone, that silence was corrosive and distance was deadly, and forgetting someone was a choice that compounded every day. You didn't choose differently. I don't know if you'll ever read this, one letter said, but I need to say it anyway. When Naomi died, I was scared. Scared of your grief. Scared I wouldn't know what to say. Scared that showing up would make it worse instead of better. So I did nothing, and doing nothing turned out to be the worst choice I could have made. Another letter dated 3 years earlier. I saw a fat boy today that looked like yours. Followed it for 10 miles hoping it was you. Wasn't, of course. But it made me realize I've been looking for you in every rider I pass, hoping for a second chance I probably don't deserve. And near the bottom of the box, dated just 6 months before Randall's death, I'm sick, ghost. Heart's failing. Doctors give me a year if I'm lucky. And all I can think about is dying without making this right. Without telling you that losing you broke something in all of us. That the club hasn't been the same since you left. That I'm sorry, so goddamn sorry. Dalton cried reading them. Not the wrenching sobs from the garage when the bike started, but quiet tears that fell unchecked and landed on paper that had waited years to deliver its message. He wasn't the only one who'd been lost. He wasn't the only one who'd suffered. The brotherhood had fractured when he disappeared, and the cracks had spread in ways none of them had predicted. They'd all failed each other, and maybe recognizing that was the first step toward not failing again. 6 weeks passed, and Sunday morning rides became the rhythm that structured Dalton's life. Every week at 6 in the morning, the Iron Wolves gathered at the Bluebird Cafe on the edge of town, and every week Dalton was there. The rides weren't long at first. 50 miles, 75, building endurance in a body that had forgotten what endurance felt like. But gradually the distances increased, and with them came something Dalton had thought was lost forever. Joy. Not happiness exactly, not the absence of grief or the erasure of loss, but the ability to feel something other than numbness. The capacity to be present in a moment without the past crushing down on every second. He started teaching Maddox about bike maintenance, passing on knowledge he'd accumulated over decades of riding. How to read engine sounds. How to feel when something was wrong before the problem became critical. How to maintain a machine so it would take care of you when miles got hard and conditions got worse. Maddox absorbed it all with the hunger of someone who'd never had a father figure to teach him these things. And in teaching, Dalton found purpose, found that he still had something to offer, found that being useful mattered more than he'd remembered. Bridget started joining the rides occasionally, riding passenger on Gus's bike. She'd been resistant at first, worried about leaving her father alone, worried about what might happen if she wasn't there to monitor his mental state. But Dalton had insisted. "You've been taking care of me for 15 years, he told her. It's time you started taking care of yourself. So she'd climbed on the back of Gus's Harley, wrapped her arms around his waist, and discovered what her mother had known all along. That there was freedom in movement. That wind in your face could blow away cobwebs that therapy and time couldn't touch. That sometimes the best thing you could do for your mental health was ride until you couldn't think anymore. She started dating again. Carefully at first, convinced she couldn't leave her father alone for full evenings. But Dalton encouraged it, practically pushed her out the door when a coworker asked her to dinner. "You deserve a life," he told her. "You've earned it 1,000 times over." The Lost Wolves project started almost by accident. Waylon mentioned during a ride that his son hadn't spoken to him in 11 years. Not since Waylon had chosen a run over his son's college graduation. The kind of choice that seemed reasonable at the time and unforgivable in retrospect. What if we found him, Dalton suggested. What if we showed up and tried to make it right? The idea took root. If they could reconnect with Dalton after 15 years, maybe they could find other brothers who drifted away. Other men who disappeared into their own versions of grief or shame or simple geography. They made a list. 15 names to start. Men who'd been iron wolves once and had faded into silence for reasons nobody had bothered to investigate. Tank in Chicago was first. The man they'd seen at Randall's funeral. Turned out he'd left the club after a bitter divorce, convinced nobody would want him around when he was broken and angry and barely holding his life together. Clifford and Dalton flew out on a Thursday, rented a car, and tracked Tank down to a studio apartment above a mechanic shop where he worked 60 hours a week to afford child support and basic survival. The look on Tank's face when he opened the door and saw them standing there was worth the plane ticket. "We came to bring you home," Clifford had said. Tank had broken down, actually collapsed against the doorframe, and cried like a man who'd been holding it together through sheer force of will and had finally been given permission to fall apart. They'd stayed 3 days, helped him pack, settled his affairs, brought him back to Bakersfield, where the club found him work at a shop that paid better and treated him like family. And on his first Sunday ride with the Wolves, Tank had pulled alongside Dalton at a stoplight and said just 2 words through tears. "Thank you." Quincy Doyle in Phoenix came next. The record said he'd been paralyzed from the waist down in a crash back in 2012. The club had sent flowers to the hospital and then collectively assumed he couldn't ride anymore, so why bother staying in touch? They found him in a VA facility, bitter and isolated, and convinced the world had moved on without him. Dalton had walked in with a tablet showing designs for hand controls, for adaptive equipment that would let a man with no leg function ride a 3-wheeled Harley or a modified 2-wheeler with proper setup. "You think I can still ride?" Quincy had asked, and the hope in his voice was heartbreaking. "I know you can," Dalton had replied, "if you want to." They'd raised money through the club, $5,000 in a week from members who remembered Quincy and wanted to help. Bought the equipment, modified a bike, taught Quincy how to use it. And when he rolled into Bakersfield 3 months later on a trike with hand controls riding under his own power, for the first time in 13 years, he'd cried so hard he had to pull over twice. "I thought I'd never feel wind again," he'd told Dalton. "Thought that part of my life was over." "Nothing's over until you decide it's over," Dalton had said and meant it. Griffin Booth in Seattle was harder. He'd left the club 7 years earlier when his daughter came out as transgender, and Griffin had assumed the brotherhood wouldn't accept her, wouldn't accept him for supporting her. He'd been wrong, but by the time he realized it, years had passed, and the gap felt too wide to bridge. The Wolves showed up at Seattle Pride with rainbow flags attached to their bikes and rode in formation behind Griffin's daughter and her advocacy group. 24 leather-clad bikers making a statement that family meant family, no conditions, no exceptions. Griffin had watched from the sidewalk in shock. Then he'd stepped into the street and joined the formation, tears streaming down his face, riding with brothers who'd never stopped being brothers, even when he'd convinced himself they had. But it was during the Seattle trip that everything changed. That the Lost Wolves project became something bigger and more urgent than just reconnection. They'd been having dinner at a diner near Pike Place Market when Clifford's phone rang. The conversation was short, his face going pale as he listened. When he hung up, his hands were shaking. "That was Randall's widow," he said quietly. "She wanted us to know the truth about how he died." "Heart attack," Gus said. "That's what the death certificate said." Clifford shook his head. "Overdose, painkillers. He'd been dealing with chronic pain from old injuries 4 years. Got addicted. His family covered it up because they didn't want the club to know he'd died that way." The table went silent, the implications settling over them like a weight. "How many more?" Dalton said finally. "How many brothers are out there right now suffering in silence, convinced they can't ask for help because asking for help means showing weakness?" The question hung unanswered because nobody knew. Because the culture they'd built, the brotherhood they'd sworn to, had an unspoken rule that real men handled their problems alone. That needing help was failure. That vulnerability was weakness. and that culture was killing them. We change it, Dalton said. We find every brother who's struggling and we show up. We make it okay to not be okay. We stop pretending strength means suffering alone. The Lost Wolves Project expanded. They created a phone tree, a support network, monthly meetings specifically for brothers dealing with addiction, depression, chronic pain, PTSD. They brought in therapists who specialized in veteran populations and working class men. They made it clear that asking for help was as valid as offering it, and slowly, carefully, the culture began to shift. 12 weeks after Randall's funeral, the Iron Wolves held a rally. 500 bikes from 8 states all gathering in Bakersfield for a weekend dedicated to a single theme, No Brother Left Behind. The planning had taken months, coordination with local authorities, fundraising for the venue, outreach to clubs across the western states. But it came together in ways that felt almost miraculous, as if the universe had decided this mattered enough to smooth the rough edges. Dalton had been involved in the planning but hadn't known everything. Clifford had kept some details back, claiming he wanted them to be surprises. And on Saturday afternoon, when Dalton showed up at the main pavilion, he understood why. Because Bridget was standing on the stage with a microphone about to speak to 500 bikers about the father they'd almost lost. Dalton tried to back out, but Gus blocked his path. "She asked to do this," Gus said. "Let her." Bridget's voice carried across the assembled crowd, amplified by speakers, but strong enough that she probably didn't need them. "My father almost became a statistic," she said. "Not because he was weak, not because he gave up, but because we live in a world where men learn to suffer in silence, where asking for help is treated like failure, where the strongest thing a man can do is supposed to be handling everything alone." She paused, letting the words land. "The Iron Wolves failed my father 15 years ago. When his wife died and his world ended, they gave him space. That's what they called it. Space. But space was just another word for absence, for not showing up, for deciding his grief made them uncomfortable, so it was easier to let him fade away than to sit with him in the darkness." Dalton felt Clifford tense beside him, but Bridget wasn't done. "But they came back," she continued. 15 years late, imperfect, scared they'd be rejected. But they came back, and that second chance saved my father's life." She looked directly at Dalton then, and her eyes were wet. Dad almost wrote his own ending in a garage with a bike he couldn't bring himself to start. He almost became another name people used to know, another brother who disappeared while everyone else stayed busy. But he didn't, because someone noticed he was gone, because someone cared enough to feel guilty, because someone decided that 15 years wasn't too long to try again. The crowd was completely silent now, 500 bikers listening to a young woman tell them truths they needed to hear. "How many of you are carrying guilt right now?" Bridget asked. "How many of you know a brother who's struggling and you haven't called, haven't checked in, haven't shown up because you don't know what to say or you're afraid you'll make it worse?" Hands started going up, slowly at first, then more. Dozens, hundreds, an ocean of raised hands acknowledging failures they'd been carrying alone. "This rally isn't just about my dad," Bridget said. "It's about all of us. Every person here who's ever felt alone. Every brother who's disappeared because nobody checked. Every family member who's watched someone they love fade away and didn't know how to stop it." She set down the microphone and stepped off the stage, and the crowd erupted. Not in applause exactly, but in something deeper. Recognition, collective acknowledgement, the sound of people realizing they weren't alone in their failures or their fears. Dalton met his daughter at the base of the stage and pulled her into a hug that said everything words couldn't. "That's my girl," he whispered into her hair. She'd just done something he'd never had the courage to do. She'd made his pain matter by using it to help others. She'd turned his near death into a tool for saving lives. "That's my girl," he whispered into her hair. "That's my brave, brilliant girl." The rally continued through the weekend. Workshops on mental health, panels on addiction recovery, support groups forming organically in corners and around campfires, brothers connecting with brothers they'd lost track of, phone numbers exchanged, promises made to check in, to stay in touch, to not let another 15 years pass in silence. And on Sunday morning they rode, 500 bikes in formation moving through Bakersfield like a river of chrome and leather and collective purpose. The sound was deafening. The sight was spectacular. Local news covered it. Social media exploded with videos and photos. But more than the spectacle, more than the numbers, what mattered was the intention behind it. 500 men and women publicly declaring that vulnerability was strength, that asking for help was courage, that no brother rides alone. Dalton rode in the middle of the pack, surrounded by brothers, old and new, and felt something he hadn't felt since Naomi died. He felt like he belonged, like his life had purpose beyond just surviving until tomorrow. Like the pain he'd carried might have actually mean something if he could use it to prevent someone else from carrying the same weight. 3 months after the rally, Gus's Parkinson's symptoms got worse. His hands started trembling, too much to safely control a bike at highway speeds. The club voted to suspend his riding privileges, and Gus had exploded. The confrontation happened after a Sunday ride in the parking lot of the Bluebird Cafe. Gus had barely been able to keep his bike steady on the last few miles, and everyone had seen it. "You're taking away the only thing I have left," Gus shouted at Clifford, his voice breaking. "You're making me into what I've been fighting against. You're making me weak." "We're keeping you alive," Clifford shot back. "There's nothing weak about that." Dalton stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "No, we're making the same mistake we made with me." Both men looked at him. "You're deciding for him," Dalton said to Clifford. "You're taking away his choice because you think you know better. Just like you decided I needed space 15 years ago instead of asking what I actually needed." Then to Gus, "And you're confusing adaptation with surrender. Riding doesn't have to look one way. It just has to be riding." "What are you talking about?" Gus said. Dalton pulled out his phone and showed them pictures he'd been researching for weeks. Adaptive equipment for riders with Parkinson's, trikes with stability controls, modified handlebars with tremor dampening, electronic shifting systems that didn't require fine motor control. "We don't take away your bike," Dalton said. "We modify it so you can keep riding. We adapt. We overcome. We find a way because that's what we do." The fight went out of Gus's eyes, replaced by something that looked like hope. "You think that could work? I know it can," Dalton said, "because Quincy told me it saved his life. Because adapting isn't giving up. It's choosing to keep living even when living gets harder." They raised $7,000 in 2 weeks, modified Gus's bike with equipment specifically designed for neurological conditions, installed electronic controls that compensated for hand tremors, added stability features that made balance less critical. And when Gus rode for the first time with the modifications, when he made it 50 miles without incident and pulled into the Bluebird Cafe with tears streaming down his face, Dalton understood something fundamental. Healing wasn't about going back to who you were before. It was about becoming someone new who could carry the damage and keep moving forward anyway. The parallel situation with Waylon came to a head the same month. His son, who hadn't spoken to him in 11 years, lived in Sacramento. The silence had started over Waylon choosing a motorcycle run over his son's college graduation, and it had calcified into something that felt permanent. Dalton had pushed Waylon to reach out, to make the call, to try. "He won't answer," Waylon had said. "It's been too long. Some things can't be fixed." "You don't know that until you try," Dalton had replied, "and not trying guarantees you're right." So Waylon had called, left a voicemail that was awkward and stumbling and completely sincere. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm trying to be better. If you ever want to ride with your old man, I'd like that. No pressure. Just an offer." The response came 3 days later. Not a phone call, but a text. Just 4 words. "Next Sunday, Bluebird Cafe." Waylon had stared at those 4 words like they were written in a language he didn't quite speak. Then he'd shown Dalton his hand shaking. "What do I do? You show up," Dalton had said, "and you let him decide what comes next." Sunday came and Waylon's son arrived on a Yamaha sport bike, young and uncertain, and clearly terrified this was a mistake. Waylon had stood beside his Harley, equally terrified, until Dalton had given him a push. "Go talk to your kid." The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Dalton couldn't hear it from where he stood with the other wolves, but he could see the body language. Stiff at first, defensive, then gradually softening. Waylon's son gesturing, while he talked animated years of stored words finally finding release. Waylon listening, really listening, not defending or explaining, just hearing his son's pain. When they finished talking, Waylon's son looked at the assembled Iron Wolves, looked at his father, looked at the open road stretching out before them. One ride, he said, then we'll see. They rode that Sunday. Waylon and his son and the rest of the pack. Just 50 miles out and 50 miles back, nothing dramatic, nothing that required declarations or promises about the future. But when they got back, Waylon's son agreed to coffee. And after coffee, he agreed to dinner the following week. And after dinner, he asked if he could come on another ride. Small steps. Careful reconciliation. The kind that might actually last because it was being built on honesty instead of grand gestures. Dalton watched it unfold and thought about Naomi's letter, about living instead of surviving, about second chances and the men brave enough to take them. 1 year after the first ride to Randall's funeral, the Iron Wolves gathered again. But this time it wasn't for a funeral, it was for a celebration. The Lost Wolves Project had reconnected 47 brothers across 8 states. 3 addiction recovery programs had been established specifically for MS members. 2 support groups for families of riders were meeting monthly. The suicide hotline they'd funded had fielded over 300 calls in its first year of operation. Gus rode every Sunday with his modified bike, leading new members on their first runs and teaching them that strength came in many forms. Waylon's son had joined the club as a prospect, learning from the same men who taught his father, building his own relationship with brotherhood that honored the past without being bound by it. Bridget had opened a nonprofit supporting families of veterans and motorcycle club members, using her own experience to help others navigate grief and caregiving and the complicated dynamics of loving someone who chose a life most people didn't understand. And Dalton rode every Sunday morning, leading the pack, sometimes following, other times, but always present, always showing up, always choosing to participate in his life instead of watching it pass by from a safe distance. He visited Naomi's grave every week, but the visits had changed. They were no longer about guilt or grief that paralyzed. They were conversations with someone he'd loved and lost, updates on a life he was actually living, promises kept instead of promises broken. The bike sat in his garage with the tarp long gone, always ready, always waiting. The lipstick mark on the tank had been carefully preserved under a clear coat, visible but protected, a reminder of what had been and what could still be. On the anniversary of that first ride, Dalton stood at Naomi's headstone with 2 photographs in his hands. One showed him and Naomi on the bike, young and laughing, and absolutely certain moments like that would last forever. The other showed him now, gray and weathered, and surrounded by brothers alive in ways that mattered even when they hurt. He placed both photos against the headstone, securing them with stones so the wind wouldn't carry them away. I kept my promise, he said, to the granite and the grass and the spirit of the woman he'd loved. I'm living again. Not the same life we had, but a life, a real one. He'd brought Naomi's letter with him, the one Bridget had saved for 15 years. He read it aloud one more time, letting the words settle over him like a benediction. When he finished, he folded it carefully and put it back in his vest pocket, right over his heart, where it would stay, where it belonged. Behind him, he heard the rumble of engines, the Sunday ride gathering, brothers assembling to do what they did every week without fail. Show up, ride together, prove that no brother rides alone. Dalton turned away from the grave and walked back to where the wolves waited. Bridget was there, standing beside her own bike, now a Sportster she'd bought with money saved from the nonprofit. She'd started riding solo 6 months ago, and watching her learn had been one of the purest joys of Dalton's resurrection. "Ready, Dad?" she asked. Dalton looked at his daughter, at the brothers assembled, at the morning sun painting everything in shades of gold that made the chrome shine like promise. "Yeah," he said, "I'm ready." They mounted up, and Dalton took his position in the formation. Not always in front, not always in back, just somewhere in the pack, surrounded by people who'd failed him and come back, who'd been failed and forgiven, who understood that brotherhood was messy and imperfect and worth fighting for anyway. Clifford led them out, and the pack fell into familiar formation. The sound of 30 engines in harmony filled the morning air, announcing to the world that the Iron Wolves were riding, that broken men had found ways to mend, that second chances were real if you were brave enough to take them. They rode through Bakersfield as the city woke, past Rosie's Diner, where this had all started with a waitress mentioning her father's bike. Past the house Dalton had almost died in, now just a place where he slept between rides. Past the cemetery where Naomi waited patient as only the dead can be, her spirit riding with them in ways that mattered more than presence. The highway opened up before them and speed built gradually. 30 miles per hour, 40, 50. The wind pushed against Dalton's chest and he leaned into it, muscle memory and healing working together to keep him steady. His body still ached from arthritis and age and years of construction work. His back would hurt tomorrow. His hands would be stiff. He wasn't young anymore, wasn't the man who'd started riding 40 years ago, convinced he was invincible. But he was alive, really truly alive, and that counted for more than he could express. They rode north toward the mountains, chasing horizon and purpose and the simple joy of movement. No destination required, no deadline to meet, just miles accumulating and brothers riding and the road stretching out before them like possibility made manifest. Dalton thought about the suicide note Bridget had found 2 years ago, thought about how close he'd come to writing his own ending in that garage, thought about all the miles he would have missed, all the reconciliations that wouldn't have happened, all the brothers who would still be lost if he'd made that final choice. He thought about Randall Tully and the letters that had arrived too late but mattered anyway, about Tank in Chicago and Quincy in Phoenix and Griffin in Seattle and all the other lost wolves they'd found and brought home. He thought about Gus riding beside him on modified equipment that let him keep doing the thing he loved despite a body that was failing. About Waylon and his son building something new from the wreckage of what had been broken. He thought about Bridget riding her own bike now, free from the burden of being his only reason to live, able to build her own life because he'd finally started living his. And he thought about Naomi, whose love had been strong enough to reach across death and 15 years of grief to tell him the truth he'd needed to hear. That living wasn't betrayal. That joy wasn't disrespect. That moving forward didn't mean leaving her behind. The pack crested a hill and the valley spread out below them, bathed in morning light that made everything look new. Clifford signaled and they took the scenic route, the long way, the path that added miles instead of cutting them. Because that's what they did now. They took the long way. They added miles. They showed up and kept showing up and refused to let distance or time or accumulated failures stop them from trying. Dalton's hand lifted off the grip for just a moment, reaching toward the sky, toward Naomi, toward the future he'd almost thrown away. A gesture of gratitude and acknowledgement and promise. Then his hand came back down to the grip and he throttled forward into the miles ahead. Behind them, the road disappeared into the distance they'd covered. Before them, the highway stretched toward horizons they hadn't reached yet. And between those 2 points, in the space between what had been and what might still be, the Iron Wolves rode. Together. Healing. The way it was always supposed to be, the way it could be if enough people chose showing up over staying comfortable. If enough people decided that second chances mattered more than being right. If enough people understood that brotherhood wasn't about never failing, it was about coming back after you failed and trying again. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the coastal fog, and the day opened up before them full of possibility and promise, and the simple truth that every mile forward was a choice, a decision to keep living, a commitment to being present for whatever came next. And Dalton Brennan, who'd been a ghost for 15 years, who'd almost become a statistic, who'd learned the hard way that grief could kill you as surely as any disease, rode into that future with his brothers beside him and his daughter finding her own way, and the memory of his wife setting him free to actually live. No longer surviving, no longer hiding, no longer waiting for permission to participate in his own life. Just riding, just living, just being the man Naomi had always believed he could be, even when he'd stopped believing it himself. The road went on forever, and that was exactly the point.